Welcome back. Private equity has been rapidly growing its share of the housing market, taking advantage of a housing crisis and in some cases exacerbating it. As corporate landlords gain influence, tenants are uniting and innovatively targeting their vulnerabilities. This involves voicing grievances to regulators and public pension funds that invest in private equity. Joining us now is the Housing Research Coordinator at Private Equity Stakeholder Project, Madeline Bankson. Madeline, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here.
Now, the Private Equity Stakeholder Project aims to bring transparency and accountability to the private equity industry. Can you just elaborate on the project's overall goals?
Yeah, exactly. We're a watchdog nonprofit. So we're working partially as an advocacy organization and partially as what you would typically think of as a think tank, but mostly just trying to mitigate the impact of the private equity industry on people and the planet. So we're working in 5 major issue areas. That's healthcare, climate, detention surveillance, and labor, as well as housing, where I work.
And how does it empower communities and working families impacted by private equity investments?
Yes, so we tried to take as much guidance as possible from folks who are most impacted by the private equity industry, whether that be as workers or as tenants. And we try to see what issues they're dealing with and help them to strategize to solve those issues. So, whether that be trying to work with their investors in order to motivate change or to draw attention to the issues these people are facing, or even doing policy work, we kind of do it all.
Now, the private equity industry has become a significant player in various sectors, including housing. Could you provide an overview of how private equity has expanded its influence in the housing market and why this trend is concerning for stakeholders?
Yes, absolutely. So private equity is increasingly touching many parts of people's lives, and housing is no exception. So if you can name a type of housing, private equity probably has investments there. So they're buying up mobile home parks, they're getting involved in multifamily housing or apartment buildings, and increasingly they're also purchasing up single family rentals all around the country. Um, this has all sorts of impacts for tenants as it's one of the most important parts of their lives, as well as would-be home buyers. But what we're really kind of seeing is that tenants often have, to say that it's negative customer service experiences is putting it a little bit lightly. Folks are being displaced by increasing rent. They're dealing with all kinds of home maintenance issues and other predatory practices. In general, it's also making it much more expensive to buy a home in certain markets where private equity is extremely active, and rents are increasing there as well.
Okay, so I want to clarify this is affecting pretty much everybody, whether you're a homeowner or somebody looking to buy a home, as well as renters?
I would say that's correct. Renters are going to be the most impacted, especially low income renters. But folks who are seeking to buy homes or who are generally just looking at the housing market are impacted as well.
Now, the housing market has witnessed significant private equity investment with large corporate landlords acquiring both, as you mentioned, multifamily and single family homes. How has this trend impacted housing affordability and tenant rights? And does your project work to hold these landlords accountable?
Yes, that is the main goal of our work, is to make sure that people are able to understand what's happening with private equity in the housing space, as well as to hold them accountable. It's a little hard to draw a direct parallel to price increases, but what we have seen is in markets where investors are active, there are skyrocketing both rent rates and housing costs. Um, Furthermore, beyond just kind of the price concerns, which obviously are a huge deal for many people, we are seeing that tenant conditions are worsening. So sometimes tenants are forced onto month-to-month leases, so they have less stability. Other times people are dealing with prolonged maintenance issues, and many people are also being evicted, which can really harm someone's life when they have that eviction on their record for 7 years. It's almost impossible to get a new home. So overall, just really kind of undermining people's day-to-day ability to live and thrive.
Yeah, I want to talk about basically what can individuals, communities, and organizations do to get involved and advocate for change in this industry. But first, how do you educate so many of these communities where I'm assuming that a lot of people don't really know what's going on or what's even happening? They just probably see this change happening around them.
Well, I will say that you have to give people credit. I think they're very aware that their material conditions are shifting for the worse, but they don't always understand the mechanisms for why. So what we do is assume that people are smart and just help them locate some of these pinch points for where they can leverage their power over private equity. So when we see tenants organize, which is the most effective method of intervention, a strong tenant organization, we can kind of work with them to do all kinds of things. So that's perhaps helping them garner media attention. Other times it is supporting the tenants in trying to negotiate with the private equity firms themselves, or even to speak with their investors to try and leverage that investor influence.
Now, can you provide, oh, I'm sorry, you can continue.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to know, were there any specific examples of negative impacts of private equity's ownership of rental housing?
Yes, I want to draw attention to one of our particular tenant partners, the organization African Communities Together, or ACT. ACT is organizing in Alexandria, Virginia, against the company CIM Group, which is a private equity firm based in Los Angeles. They have a complex where traditionally African immigrants have lived and thrived for many years, but upon CIM purchasing the complex, it's become more expensive to live there, evictions have become more frequent, and it's become much more difficult for the tenants there to get remedies for maintenance issues and other customer service issues. They've been through a lot of different kinds of things. A persistently broken elevator was one thing, but I think overall they're really strongly organized and they are working with federal regulators in order to spur motivation. That's one instance where we can see, or sorry, to spur change rather than motivation. And that's one instance where we're working to see just serious improvement because tenants banded together.
Now, in recent years, private equity firms have invested heavily in affordable housing, often targeting units where rent restrictions are set to expire. How does this investment pattern impact communities relying on these units for affordable housing? And what are the potential consequences for vulnerable populations?
So in the United States, we have shifted a lot of what would traditionally be public housing into the affordable housing model, particularly through low-income housing tax credit, as well as a few other programs. What we're seeing is that firms, especially including Blackstone Group is one that we have looked at, have bought up these affordable housing portfolios. And that's just gravely concerning, mostly because we know that these companies are very driven in general by profit. I'll stop there.
Now, the pandemic prompted a surge in investment by mega landlords in properties with temporarily reduced values. How has this affected the housing market, and what potential consequences do you see for affordable housing in the coming years?
Yes, we're seeing all over the country. There is really just increased investment in single family housing in particular that has made it essentially impossible in some places for regular people to afford a home. So in places like Atlanta, we see that private equity firms in the area own 65,000 homes. That's effectively making it so that regular people just simply can't compete either with the rising costs, or they can't no longer get a home, maybe even in the neighborhood where they grew up. This has really tremendous implications for racial justice in particular. Private equity firms, more so even than other corporate landlords, tend to target their investment for single family homes in predominantly Black neighborhoods and predominantly lower income neighborhoods. So a lot of those starter homes are getting taken up. Overall, things have calmed down a bit. There was a lot of investor activity in 2021, but the overall trend is still really concerning, and lawmakers should be paying attention, as should tenants.
And I wanted to expand on that because I noticed previously you mentioned the ACT organization with that was with the building with a lot of African immigrants, and you also mentioned just now this also impacts a lot of Black communities. Can you just expand on how this impacts communities of color a little bit different from other communities?
Yes, absolutely. So like I just said, I think the investment that targets Black neighborhoods in particular is really a problem. But also, Black renters in particular are really disproportionately more likely to be in need of affordable housing because we live in a country where systemic racism impacts economic issues as well. So in addition to kind of buying up that supply, it means that people are much more likely to be dealing with the ramifications of displacement, evictions, and poor living conditions. And these things have a snowball effect that can last for a very long time. And as we know, there's a strong link as well between homelessness and mass incarceration that is worth discussing.
Thank you so much for clarifying that and expanding on that, because I definitely do think it was like something important to touch on. Now, as private equity firms expand their influence in housing and other sectors, how do you envision the industry evolving in terms of its responsibility to the economy, society, and the environment?
Yes. So what we hope is that these firms are able to commit to having investment practices that are not quite as destructive. So what we're really calling on in the housing sphere is to ensure that tenants have some basic protections, like that they're able to negotiate together collectively and be recognized, or that they are not raising rents to a really tremendous degree. Um, these are not incredibly complicated or huge asks, but they are somewhat contradictory to the business model of getting as much profit as possible. However, we do believe that it is possible for the private equity industry to behave in a way that is less harmful to tenants, workers, and other people.
With the rise of corporate landlords, what steps do you believe need to be taken to ensure that affordable housing remains accessible to those who need it most and that tenant rights are protected?
We need strong action at every level of government to counter this issue. And there are many different areas that can sort of be explored, which is good. Um, the primary thing that I personally would advocate for is going to be some form of price control in order to stop this rent gouging that has become so out of control in recent months. We have seen that it is effective, and it also stops constant speculation. It's a really powerful anti-speculative device. In addition, we also want to get more transparency and oversight. So that's just collecting information about what these companies own and what LLCs they're operating through so that we can track and coordinate at a state or a federal level. Transparency obviously is not enough. So we're also going to want to have the types of laws that limit the amount of homes these folks are able to own so that other people have more of a shot, whether that's through making the buying process more friendly to regular individuals or just overall placing caps on how much wealth these companies can amass. In addition, there's a lot of local action that we can take, and I have actually written the report about that.
Oh, are you able to talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So the best way that we're going to counter private equity is really just to have robust tenant protections in addition to the sort of price control and like antitrust type work I was just discussing. Having robust tenant protections really makes sure that sort of the worst impacts of these extractive practices are not harming people. So one thing that works really well that we've seen is requiring landlords to have licenses and collecting their information in a database. In addition to that, pairing that with some kind of proactive rental inspection to ensure that tenants have a basic quality of housing is gravely important for this moment in time.
And what can people do to basically kind of learn more about this and know what resources are available to help them?
Yes, the private equity industry is extremely complex and difficult to understand, but the work of our organization is to make that intelligible to people. So you can check out our website, that's pestakeholder.org, where we have kind of plain language blogs breaking down how private equity operates in each of our issue areas. In addition, we also have webinars and popular education materials that are intended to educate community groups if you are so interested.
All right, well, Madeline,
And
thank you.
furthermore, I'm sorry, I would just say
Yeah.
I would encourage people to work with their local tenants organizations, many of whom are very aware of this issue and are already kind of working to fight it.
All right, well, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this important discussion.
Thank you.
We have to take a quick break, but we'll be back right after this.